do they really have this kind of potential to be involved within this kind of antagonism, and even more, to be involved in the war somehow with this huge nuclear country like Russia without the United States?
No, is the short answer to that. Militarily, we have insufficient troops to go to war with Russia.
Mr. Proud, thank you so much for your time, for being with us, for being on this very wonderful event, the Forum of Global Affairs, which your inputs were very important, and thank you so much for your inputs. Let's start from your background, from diplomatic work in Russia. So you quite well know what are the relations between Great Britain and Russia. What you can say, watching behind in the history, are they on the very low level right now, or do you have any kind of past time to compare with it?
I don't think there's ever been a time when relations between Russia and the United Kingdom have been as bad as they are now. Even during the Soviet Union period, there was a lot of hostility, obviously, between Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Completely opposite, communist regime, Western liberal democracy, but still, there was still dialogue and contact. There was a lot of suspicion, of course. We spied on the Soviet Union spied on us, but actually there were relations. But now there's not even the basic level of dialogue, between the United Kingdom and Russia, and that is dangerous. It's dangerous because Russia has the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. And we underestimate Russia's, and we have underestimated in Ukraine, Russia's willingness to fight for what it considers to be its core strategic interests, because of our sense of dominance, that we are collectively in the European Union, the United Kingdom and the US, economically much bigger than Russia. Of course, that's true. Yeah. But nevertheless, Russia is willing to fight, and as a collective we haven't been. So, we've resorted to sanctions, a disengagement from dialogue, and we have no way now really easily to deconflict when situations get really bad with Russia, because we're not talking to Russia. And, at the worst times in human history, during wars and so on, that is the time when you need to talk the most. That is when you need diplomacy and when you need dialogue. And too many people say, well, if you talk to Russia, you're supporting Russia, you're pro-Russian. It's not true. Diplomacy isn't about friendship. It's a bonus if you can have friendship, but it's about coexistence and getting along so that we don't end up, on the brink of nuclear war. And the British side in particular has been guilty of losing sight, of what it is we want to try and achieve with Russia, which is basic stability and European security, at a minimum level. And we're way below the sort of lowest level now, and on the brink potentially of a catastrophe.
You mentioned a very important issue, talking with Russia, because many in Georgia do consider that we have not to talk with them.
Yeah.
And there is another part who say that maybe we shall talk with them, but with our partners, not tete-a-tete, not in a bilateral talks, not bilateral communication. What you can say to these people?
Georgia has more experience than any other country in dealing with the Russian threat. Yeah. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 at a time when Georgia, egged on by George W. Bush and others, were pushing the NATO enlargement, agenda. So Georgia knows better than any other country the risks, from non-engagement with Russia, not listening to Russian concerns. And dialogue is vital, just maintaining the basics of a healthy and stable relationship is vital to avoid getting back to a situation like in 2008, that conflict becomes inevitable. It isn't about being best friends with Russia. Georgia doesn't even have formal diplomatic relations with Russia. Nobody can accuse Georgia of being pro-Russian. It's ridiculous when people...
But they do.
But they do. They do, and it's ridiculous. I mean, it doesn't have diplomatic relations. So dialogue is just about understanding their concerns, them understanding Georgian concerns, and finding ways to, deconflict and minimize risk. It's not about becoming best friends overnight. It's about the basics of, Georgia's need to maintain peace and security for its longer-term sort of growth and stability.
What do you think about the so-called legitimate concerns of Russia regarding West? What is the legitimacy of these concerns?
Well, people get tripped up on legitimate, frankly.
Yeah.
Every country has concerns.
Yeah.
Every country decides whether those concerns are legitimate.
Yeah.
If I don't think your concerns are legitimate, then I can tell you, but that doesn't stop them being concerns for that country. So talking about whether it's legitimate is irrelevant. It's these are Russia concerns, these are our concerns. How can we talk to Russia to manage both countries' concerns to avoid conflict? The legitimacy thing is a false discussion. It doesn't matter if we disagree with Russia's concerns. They are Russia's concerns, and we have to talk to them about it to kind of deconflict.
But there could be some kind of illusions about concerns. If we consider the illusionist concerns, where we can get to?
Well, Russia really only has had one expressed concern since 2006. Almost 20 years. It hasn't changed. Lots of new concerns have arrived since 2014, of course, but there's been one core concern, actually dates back to 1998, but in contemporary sort of geopolitics, you can trace it right back to 2006, when the Baltic countries joined NATO and the EU, right? That was the moment, when Putin started really to feel that this supposed promise that NATO wouldn't expand had been broken. Now, we can disagree that that was a legitimate concern for Putin to have. We could say, well, it's none of your business, but that is still his concern. And what we've done is we've refused to talk to Putin about those concerns. We've ignored those concerns. We've hoped they'd go away. We've endured a war in Georgia and almost forgotten already, that happened, and ended up in the same mistake in a much, much worse and dangerous way in Ukraine, today. So the origin of Russia's concerns are quite simple. They feel, whether we agree or not, that the expansion of NATO up to their border is a core strategic risk to their country.
And why West ignored that concern?
Because I think there was a belief, certainly in the British government, for a long time in the US government, maybe not now under Trump, but certainly before Trump, that actually, Russia would eventually give up. It would bend to the will, because NATO is the biggest military alliance in the world. It spends 53% of total global military spending. Is spent just by NATO. Every other country in the world combined doesn't spend as much as NATO. Putin was worried about that. And I think, we've assumed that because we're so big economically, the EU and the US combined is like 27 times bigger economically than Russia. So there's this belief, arrogance, if you like, to call it that because we're militarily and economically bigger than Russia in terms of this kind of twisted mindset, that actually eventually Russia would stop complaining about NATO and we could all carry on as normal. But what they forgot was that Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. And Putin is such a kind of character that he won't back down in a fight. It would be completely contrary to his upbringing as a former KGB officer, steeped in that kind of Soviet mythology, and the fact that he's spent, over a decade telling his Russian sort of voters that this is a risk. He doesn't have potential and scope domestically within Russia to back down. So backing down is a catastrophe politically for Putin in Russia because he would be seen to be weak, and he can't do that. So we've just assumed that he would back down, and at every moment when he showed that he wouldn't back down, we've carried on anyway, hoping that maybe eventually he will back down, to the point now where our policies have become self-defeating.
Could this ignorance be changed by Trump's comeback, or what should be happened to change this kind of ignorance from the Western side?
I see no signs or very little evidence that there is a change taking place, right now. Trump is saying some positive things on Ukraine, but he's yet to have a decisive role in shifting. In fact, because people in the European Union and the UK hate Trump so much, actually there's almost been an opposite reaction, that European and British leaders have become even more hardline on the Ukraine war. They don't want the hated Trump telling, they see Trump and Putin as best friends, and they'll do everything not to bend to Trump's will. So he hasn't had a decisive impact. And if he wants to end the war in Ukraine, he has to be more decisive. He has to cut all military assistance to Ukraine and tell the EU flat that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. And it's only with pretty hard steps will Zelensky see that he has to actually kind of draw the line on peace, because peace is a two-way bargain, right? And bring the war to an end. Without that, it will continue into 2026. The European Union will have to put in another 40 billion, just to fund the war for another year. And that's not just to kind of pay for military assistance. That's to run the Ukrainian state. Ukraine is massively indebted. Every year it racks up 20% of GDP in new debt, and it has to borrow from Western nations. It's a completely unsustainable economically and politically situation, and is pushing Ukraine closer to failed state status. And NATO is still saying, well, your path to NATO membership is irreversible, but Ukraine is still losing the war, and NATO isn't offering to send troops to help them. They're saying, well, maybe after the war you can join, but keep fighting.
Yes. Yeah.
It's so crazy.
Which is hypocrisy. Yeah.
It's hypocrisy.
Yeah, and let's a little bit stress our attention to this difference between Trump and other Western leaders. So, as you mentioned in the very first answer, this is the kind of the worst relations between Great Britain and Russia, in the recent history at least. And the Great Britain has become the leader of the antagonisms towards Russia with French President Macron. Do they really have this kind of potential to be involved within this kind of antagonism, and even more, to be involved in the war somehow with this huge nuclear country like Russia without the United States?
No, is the short answer to that. Militarily, we have insufficient troops to go to war with Russia. We've given large parts of our ammunition stockpiles already to Ukraine. When Britain and France were talking about a reassurance force or a peacekeeping force, they thought at best, we could muster 30,000 troops. Maybe the UK could provide 10,000 troops. There are 600,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. What are we going to do with 10,000 troops? Estonia said, well, we're massively going to increase our military spending. Estonia has about 2,000 troops in the whole country. What are they going to do against 600,000 troops in Russia? So it's all political posturing. People say, well, we'll take on Russia, but we don't have the troops. We don't have the money. the UK has economic problems itself, right now. We can't even afford to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. How can we afford to fight a war with Russia with 10,000 troops and no money? It's completely delusional thinking.
So in that regard, could US approach to this conflict prevail the Europeans?
I think it has to. There has to come a point where both the battlefield losses that the Ukraine is suffering become so bad, the bussification of Ukrainian young men being beaten up on the streets and loaded into minibuses and shipped to the front line attracts media attention in the West, which it never has, because there's a lot of press censorship in the West, actually, of anything happening in Ukraine that isn't about ultimate victory over. It's almost like we're living with the greatest of respect in the Soviet Union in terms of the level of propaganda and censorship in the UK media right now. And we'll realise that we just can't afford to pay the bill because politically there's a huge cost to us. We've seen Alternative for Deutschland continue to grow in popularity. We've seen the Reform Party in the UK, grow in popularity. The longer this carries on, the more support they will gain, from politicians saying, well, this isn't working. We need a different approach.
The main issue is that the US, at least Trump and some fellows inside the government, do understand that their main competitor in this multipolar world is China, not Russia.
Yeah.
And many explain that what they're doing right now is trying to split the alliance between Russia and China. This is no matter how much they will be succeed in this issue, but this is their approach, kind of. Why that is not understood in Europe? Why they are not trying to become the independent pole in multipolarity and play the independent game?
It would make much more sense for them to do so. They do need to wean themselves off of over-reliance on the United States, not just economically, but also militarily. I mean, NATO, if you think about it, is really just an internal market for weapon supplies. It's an unelected bureaucracy, really, that has a need to, exist. The European Union grew and thrived on economic, social, and cultural opening up and collaboration. That is what made it successful. That's what made the European continent, peaceful after centuries of eternal war between lots of small nations in Europe. Our future has to be to retain the essence of that. And eventually, people won't like it, but to kind of reopen up and engage on a similar basis, with Russia in Eurasia. It makes no sense for Europe to get energy from the United States of America. It's completely crazy. We have this whole Eurasian continent with cheap energy in the east and sort of robust economies, in the west. We need to be maximizing the complementarities and the benefits of that economically, because I believe that, when you focus on economic, social, and cultural collaboration, it makes the politics easier to manage. You look at the European Union, I mean, there's lots of political difference within the European Union, but the kind of economic, social, and cultural glue holds it together. I think the risk for the EU in particular going forward is that they lose their religion. They focus so much on geopolitics and trying to defeat, Russia, that they actually, lead themselves down the path to their own destruction. Because it's not even from fighting a war with Russia, because nobody wants to do that, even though they're happy for the war in Ukraine to happen. It's just that Europe internally will implode because some member states won't want to kind of live with the ever centralizing tendencies of the European Commission, which are happening now, which you see in Hungary, Romania, the lawfare in France, and so on. So Europe has to kind of step back from geopolitics, and sort of focus on what it does well, and then engage, in the multipolar world in a more open way with, China, with Russia, with the Middle East, with Eastern Europe and so on. It's just obvious that would be the right thing to do. But I see no sign right now that change in thinking is happening.
Why that had happened with European political elite?
I think there's a fear of failure. We invested so much political capital in defeating Russia indirectly through a proxy war in Ukraine. We're facing up to the fact that that project will fail. In fact, it already has failed, but it will fail and be seen to have failed when the war ends. Maybe that's one of the reasons that the war continues. You know, European citizens have been told since 2014 that we have to spend billions and billions, you know, on Ukraine to support it. Democracy, rule of law, LGBT rights, kind of antagonism towards Russia, now war, military expenditure. And then we'll find ourselves in a situation where Ukraine has lost the war. Ukraine wants to join the European Union and believes that it has the right to join on an accelerated basis. Ukraine will find that even when it joins the European Union, it doesn't receive the same subsidies as the existing countries because Poland will block that, you know, and so on. And it will find itself as this shattered, disgruntled, poor, you know, country in a European where it's considered a second-class member, causing even further tension and conflict with, you know, a country with the largest military in Europe at that time. I mean, you know, Ukraine has a military of 1 million people now. It's, you know, we're heading for disaster, frankly, unless there's this radical change in thinking.
So let me ask you about the NATO enlargement.
Yeah.
Is it still a live project for you, in your point of view?
I think it should stop. I mean, I think the whole basis of NATO needs to be reconsidered. You know, NATO was set up to counter the threat of the Soviet Union. And it was a real threat. It was a real threat to us. You know, they developed nuclear weapons, we developed nuclear weapons. You know, ideologically, we are completely different. The events happened in Hungary, you know, Czechoslovakia, and that sort of stuff that we all, you know and understand. That was a big geopolitical, you know, kind of threat to us. Russia has never occupied that same level of threat that the Soviet Union offered to us, and yet in our minds we kind of still stuck in the Soviet past. You know, so this, however, it was an informal promise. It was kind of tacit, or however it was defined at the time. Putin believes that a promise was made that NATO wouldn't expand to the east. You know, and it went through. You know, there was that kind of famous George Kennan article in the New York Times. Yeah. You know, before the first round of NATO enlargement, saying, "Well, this is going to be a mistake if you do this." 1997. You know, and that was completely, you know, ignored. You know. And we went through several rounds of enlargement at a time when Russia was incredibly weak. You know, the 1990s was a time when Russia was on its knees economically. You know, the oligarchs were taking power, people were being shot on the streets in business disputes. You know, it was a disaster, you know, Russia in the 1990s. And so I think at the time we kind of enlarged NATO because we knew Russia was weak. But the problem is that get into the noughties and, you know, Russia starts to grow. It starts to figure out that if it wants to be a strong regional power, it needs a strong economy. And we continue to expand NATO, and eventually kind of Russia starts to become economically quite powerful. But we keep going, and we're not listening to Putin saying, well, you know, you need to stop NATO enlargement. And we've never listened enough at the right times to say, well, actually, now's the time we should talk about this and put a halt to NATO. But the situation's so bad now that we really need to go back to the basic principles of NATO. What does it exist to do? If its existence causes wars rather than prevents wars, then maybe we should think about disbanding it and looking for an alternative security architecture for Europe.
Is there understanding of that inside the, I'd say so, the critical part of the society inside NATO, or they still believe that it should prolong its way?
So there's a difference between what society thinks and what the elites and the policymakers think. Policymakers still believe that actually Russia has no right to tell us what to do, despite what's happening in Ukraine, facing a defeat at some point.
So the war didn't help in that regard?
No, it didn't help. But for the members of the public, certainly in the United Kingdom, where I'm from, they're fed non-stop propaganda that it's all Putin's fault. Yes. And, he has no right to say who can join NATO and who can't join NATO. So there's massive propaganda and censorship of alternative points of view in the United Kingdom right now, which means that the society at large, they tend to focus on whether their kids are happy, whether they've got enough money to, feed the family, whether, most people focus on domestic issues. I believe very few people spend their time thinking about foreign policy, actually. And it's just the elites that kind of, that dominate and keep the public in the dark. But the difficulty is now that because the war in Ukraine has had, economic shockwaves across Europe, we thought it would have economic shockwaves across Russia. In fact, it's been across Europe. That's making ordinary people poorer. The UK has cut benefits for old people for their winter fuel bills, for example. All these kind of cuts to public services, while we're giving £4.5 billion a year to, Ukraine. Eventually the public is going to sit up and say, well, actually, shouldn't you be spending that money in our country, not on a war that this country is losing that is, causing us hardship? And I think that, so there's a big mismatch in the government. There's no recognition at all that Russia, has legitimate interests on NATO. Yeah. There's a kind of deluded belief that it's this kind of boiling the frog analogy. We start the water cold and we gradually turn up the heat, and eventually the water will get hot enough that the frog will die. But that's hasn't worked and isn't going to work anytime soon. I say, if we'd wanted to go to war with Russia, it was in 2014.
If the understanding of what you say, if the common sense somehow could not be returned to the European policy, what is the predictions for them?
Well, the predictions is that...
I know this is a very, very bad question to predict something, but anyway.
No, the prediction is that Europe will start to lose member states. Countries will leave the European Union, vote to leave, like the United Kingdom. It was always a risk, after the United Kingdom voted to leave. And I wasn't, by the way, in favour of Brexit. I've been sceptical about the democratic deficit in Brussels, but I thought the benefits, the economic, social and cultural benefits of membership of the European Union far outweighed the political costs in lost democracy and that sort of thing. But the problem is, once the UK left, that sent a signal to other countries that actually if they get tired of the ever centralising tendencies of the European institutions, then they might leave too. In France, anti-EU sentiment is quite strong in France, and if like Marine Le Pen's party were to get in power, now she's now been subject to lawfare, by the French courts, but if her party got into power, there's a not insignificant risk that in the next decade France could leave the EU, which would send massive shockwaves across the project, because the EU is built on the rich countries, the big three, now two, was the UK, France and Germany, subsidising the project. You lose France and then it's basically a German-dominated community, and then soon Central European countries will want to leave, Hungary, Slovakia, these countries. The whole thing will start to fall apart. That's the future, if we continue the way we're going now.
Regarding NATO, you said that it was kind of the countering the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Some say that it was just one reason why the NATO exists. But another reason was to prevent the war inside the European countries. That So with this kind of the experience of Germany and etc. So to prevent somehow the conflicts be inside the Europe, not just to prevent the Soviet Union. And somehow this was kind of, let's say so, the successful project. It could counter the Soviet Union. It prevented some conflicts inside the Europe itself. But what is today is the reason for keeping NATO together. What is the main idea, in your point of view? I mean, what should be this really very serious switch inside NATO?
Well, I don't agree with the thesis that NATO was set up to secure peace in Europe, because I think peace really came from greater economic cooperation, starting with the European coal and steel community establishment and all the iterations, that have happened, since that time. NATO doesn't have any obvious, reason to exist. It's a transatlantic partnership. Well, why do we need a transatlantic military partnership at a time of multipolarity?
Yeah, okay.
The US clearly has concerns about China, and, fine, the US can take on China. I mean, why should Europe want to fight a war against China? There's absolutely no reason at all. Yeah. If NATO exists, to make sure that we fight with America over China, then let's get rid of NATO. Is my argument.
Yeah. Do they understand that argument in Europe?
I doubt that very much. I doubt that very much. And the other reason for NATO is that actually, as I said earlier, it's a big internal market for weapons supplies.
Okay.
If you look at the share price of Raytheon RTX, one of the big US weapons manufacturers, their share price has doubled since the war in Ukraine has started. I wonder why. NATO members have to buy, their weapons from NATO suppliers. Yeah. That's over 50% of the business for US weapons manufacturers. Anybody who believes that the United States is going to withdraw from NATO under Trump is deluded. No, the US needs NATO because it earns billions and billions and billions in weapon sales from NATO countries. Why do we have Montenegro joining NATO? I mean, so that Montenegro will buy weapons from America. We're not going to fight for Montenegro. The United States certainly isn't going to fight for Montenegro under an Article 5. Other countries, Bosnia and Herzegovina, I think, are applying to join NATO and things like this. I mean, what is the point of that? It's just like it's completely crazy.
Yeah.
It serves no strategic sort of purpose at all.
So what is the solution for Georgia? We are in this country which is in between the NATO and Russia, which is in the neighborhood of Russia and NATO as well. So what is the solution for us? What could be our reasonable politics?
Your reasonable politics is to have good relations with everybody. I mean, Georgia doesn't even have diplomatic relations with Russia, right? And yet it's accused of being pro-Russian all the time. But the sensible politics is just to stay out of military alliances, and just focus on good neighborly relations, with Iran, with Turkey, with Russia, obviously with Armenia, with Azerbaijan, and be open like Kazakhstan has done. Kazakhstan has been doing multi-vector diplomacy for some time. Kazakhstan has amazing relations with the EU. Kazakhstan has amazing relations with Britain, has amazing relations with Russia and China. I mean, that it is a healthy way of being. They're not, Kazakhstan criticized Russia over the Ukraine war, but still does business, with Russia. It manages to keep that separation, in place. And you look at the most successful economic countries in the world, small states. Singapore, population of 6 million, something like that. Small, vibrant, trading with everybody, open to the world. We'll be friends with everybody. Let's keep the politics out and let's just, meet each other, invest, trade, and that sort of thing. Stick to the basics. Don't get sucked into this foolhardy idea of joining NATO or, frankly, the European Union. I mean, Georgia has lost out economically since it signed the DCFTA with the EU in 2014. European Union exports to Georgia quadrupled in that time. Georgian exports to the EU are still the same as they were in 2014. Why? Because the EU has lots of trade dispute measures, to restrict any increase in Georgian exports. So, the only thing that would happen in Georgia if you joined the European Union was that you would start to lose the young members of your labour force. Young Georgian people would suddenly move to the EU and work there, hollowing out your economy here. Much like, in fact, has been the case in Moldova, where lots of Moldovan citizens, even though it's not a member of the European Union, many of their citizens can get EU passports by virtue of the Romanian citizenship. Result, lots of Moldovan people now work in the EU, not in Moldova itself. So, focus on being a strong, robust economy that builds your own kind of labour force, that moves into kind of new sectors, economic sectors, for development, and has good relations with everybody. Don't join the EU, don't join NATO, be a strong country with good neighbourly.
You really speak like pro-Russian guy.
Don't say that.
I mean, I'm kidding. Yeah, definitely, I'm kidding. So,
But it annoys me when people say that.
Yes, I know that. Because I usually how to say it, claim it like that. Same as with this claim.
I've personally authorised 50% of all the UK sanctions against Russia. Yeah. I have.
Yes.
Personally. If anybody wants, I was in Russia when the Salisbury nerve agent attack happened.
Yeah.
And I was rebuilding the embassy.
So this is how.
If people want to call me pro-Russian, they want to look at my CV.
Yeah. Because this I would like to touch somehow this issue because this you mentioned the local propagandas in the Western countries. So they all do represent this kind of talks, talking to all countries, trading with them, and not to be some kind of neutral. Even neutrality is very forbidden issue in this
pro-Russian.
Yes.
Even neutrality is pro-Russian.
Yes.
Crazy. It's a massive oversimplification, and it's lazy, and it's irresponsible, actually, because Georgia will end up like Ukraine, frankly. Georgia would end up a worse version than Ukraine. Ukraine is a country with a population of 43 million. Georgia has a small population. It will be a disaster for Georgia, quite frankly. EU membership, maybe. There could be some pluses, there could be some minuses. I personally think on aggregate it would be a minus, for Georgia, but that's just my personal opinion. NATO membership, Russia would go to war over that. Anybody who can't see that, I'm afraid, has their head in the sand. Particularly given what happened in 2008.
Yes, definitely. Last question, as a former diplomat, where is the diplomacy today? Because we are, how to say that, it's badly needed, the diplomacy which is not existing anymore.
Well, where is diplomacy? It's a very good question. There's been a departure from diplomacy. There's been this bipolar diplomacy where we try and encourage small states to pick sides. You're with us or you're against us. It goes back to George W. Bush after 9/11. The axis of evil, you're either with us or you're against us. You're either with Israel or you're with Palestine. You're either with Taiwan or you're with China. You're with Ukraine or you're with Russia. If you're in Georgia, you're either with the EU or you're pro-Russian. Yeah. Why should we be always trying to force small countries to pick sides? It's unhealthy. Diplomacy should be about ending wars, not starting them. And that's where we're at now. Diplomacy, Western diplomacy, not necessarily kind of diplomacy in the wider multipolar world. Western diplomacy, more often than not, ends up starting wars, not ending them. And if people don't see that's a problem, then we have a big problem.
Mr. Pryke, thank you so much for your time and for your inputs. These are really very helpful. And
thank you.
So glad to have you here.
Well, I hope to come back again. It's a fabulous city.
Yes, you're kindly welcome.